Yes, well, Bolivian President Evo Morales opened this week's UN Forum on Indigenous Issues. And Aymara Indian Evo Morales became the country's first indigenous president when he was elected 2.5 years ago with more popular support than any Bolivian leader in decades. During his keynote address, President Morales raised criticism about the impact of climate change on indigenous peoples, especially the use of biofuels and how it was affecting world hunger. I had a chance to sit down with President Morales at the Bolivian mission here in New York for an interview. I began by asking him about the comments he made at the UN.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for this kind interview. I'm very pleased, as always, to talk with you and share our proposals on behalf of life. I've come at the invitation of the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Peoples of the United Nations. I was as a union to share experiences on climate change, first as a peasant union leader and second as president. Unfortunately, the so-called developing countries are the hardest hit by natural phenomena. These natural phenomena are a result of the unbridled industrialization of the Western countries. I think that the countries of the West are under an obligation to see how they can pay the environmental debt to reduce harm to the planet Earth. The planet Earth has suffered a death wound, and it must be saved, and that means saving planet Earth is to save life and to save humankind. But there are other factors that are leading to the inflation in prices for some agricultural goods, particularly biofuels and programs implemented by some presidents for some movements called biofuels or agrofuels. They are setting aside millions and millions of hectares to produce agricultural goods which are earmarked for biofuels. And it's not possible to understand in this new millennium how there are governments, presidents, institutions that are more interested in a heap of metal than in life. They're more interested in fueling luxury cars than in feeding human beings. That's where we raise a question. First, land is to be for life, and not land for scrap metal or a heap of metal. And while some presidents and some international organizations want to implement measures of this sort, well, I believe very much in the social movements. So, for example, the free trade area of the Americas, well, there's been an international movement and we've put a halt to it. In addition, there are major movements against biofuels or agrofuels, and we need to wake up some presidents and international organizations before this problem of hunger that is suffered by families and hectares of land being earmarked to cars rather than people goes any further.
You have raised some criticisms of some other Latin American leaders. You didn't name any, but it's obvious to many that some of your questioning is directed at presidents like Lula of Brazil, who has pushed biofuels. Have you talked to President Lula about this? And what's been his response, if you have?
We have had discussions at summits of heads of states, sharing some of our experiences. I'm certain that these presidents will understand the cry of the people of Bolivia, of the people of Latin America, and the whole world, which wants to have more food, not more cars. First food, and then if something's left over, more cars, more automobiles. But I think that life has to come first. But the most important thing, and this is the first time that I find I'm in agreement with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. They've publicly stated that if food prices are going up, it's precisely because of the biofuels question, and it has a major impact. So if we have these points of agreement, then we have an obligation to, together, explain and persuade these international organizations together with the social movement so as to be able to change the policies of some governments or some presidents.
There's been another important event happening this week in Latin America, the elections in Paraguay, and a new populist leader was elected, former Bishop Fernando Lugo, and one of the first things he said was that he'd like to improve relationships between Bolivia and Paraguay. Your response to his victory and how your country and his country could cooperate or build better relations.
Bueno, primero decir al compañero, hermano,
I would like to tell my colleague or brother, President-Elect Fernando Lugo, welcome to the axis of evil. But I'm so sure that it is an axis for humankind, liberating democracies that are not subjugated. They should continue to grow in Latin America. The next will certainly be in Peru, in Colombia, that there be governments or presidents who are subordinated to their peoples and not to the empire. So I'm very pleased at his election, and certainly the so-called small countries like Paraguay and Bolivia are going to have a major correlation or coincidence. We're going to improve our relations. What better than for the small countries of the region to propose and to propose together that we go forward in finding solutions with the countries of the region that are more recognized, such as Brazil and Argentina, who have a great deal of leadership, Venezuela, but they always listen to us, and we will listen to them to see how we can work out problems as in the framework of complementarity as presidents of the region.
To the axis of evil. Have I missed something? Has President Bush added Bolivia to the axis of evil in recent months?
Well, first, the axis of evil was Fidel and Chavez, and then they included me, and then they draw the president of Ecuador into it. And I'm almost certain, after having heard information, well, many would tie me and Chavez to President-elect Lugo. You know what's happening in Latin America? Any aggression or provocation by President Bush improves the image and the acceptance of candidates to the presidency. I feel that there's a rebellion in the Latin American people, especially in the South American people, vis-a-vis the empire. Before, they were dictatorships at the service of the empire. And I don't want to hide this, you know me, and that's why we've had so many interviews. And democracies are coming about as a result of people's struggles. And vis-a-vis democratic movements, there were dictatorships and dictatorships. In the last 20 years, there have been neoliberal governments that have been pro-capitalist. Now, as they've not resolved their social or structural problems, the social movements are growing with their own sentiment of dignity, of sovereignty, of development. And at this juncture, they're growing. The liberating democracies in South America are on the rise. It's very striking. That doesn't mean ending diplomatic relations with the United States or others. We want to improve diplomatic relations, our trade relations, our cooperation relations and credits, but in the framework of mutual respect. I recognize the world leadership exercised by the United States. One must recognize it, but not because, just because it's a big country, it can't subjugate, humiliate, and conspire against those governments that don't accept and that don't agree with some errors and some policies of the U.S. government. I'm not talking about the people of the United States, and we have good relations. I just had a great meeting with the indigenous movement of the United States, so there was applause. Everyone was very pleased. Sometimes it's it's with the governments that we want to have better relationships. And I have no reason to get involved in the internal matters of the United States. We respect them. But they also shouldn't meddle in my country, even though at this time there is a permanent conspiracy against the government.
I'd like to ask you about the situation domestically in your own country. When last we talked, there was a movement toward a new constitution, and there was also some discontent among some of the departments. And recently, Santa Cruz and some of the other departments have moved to call for a referendum on autonomy that the courts have ruled illegal. Your understanding of why the constitutional reform has been delayed, and what the crisis with Santa Cruz and the other three departments represents.
No es Santa Cruz.
It's not Santa Cruz.
Es algunas familias en Santa Cruz.
It's some families in Santa Cruz.
No es en otro departamento.
And it's not in other departments.